Rosie O'Donnell said something that instantly made people stop and pay attention. Not because it was loud or dramatic, but because of what it hinted at beneath the surface. It didn't sound like gossip. It sounded like someone who had seen things up close and was finally choosing her words carefully. The moment her comments started circulating, the conversation around Ellen shifted again. But this time, it wasn't about ratings or comedy. It was about patterns. Because when you look at what happened after Ellen's show ended, it doesn't feel like a clean, normal exit. It feels layered, almost like pieces of a story that don't quite fit unless you step back and connect them. Rosie didn't accuse, she didn't confirm, but she opened a door. And once that door was open, people started walking through it, asking questions that had been ignored for years. And the deeper you go into those questions, the harder it becomes to dismiss everything as coincidence. Because sometimes what's not being said is louder than what is. For nearly 2 decades, Ellen built one of the most recognizable images in entertainment. She wasn't just a talk show host. She became a symbol. The message was simple, repeated constantly, and embraced by millions. Be kind. That phrase wasn't just branding, it became her identity. But then, almost overnight, that image started to crack. Reports began surfacing from former employees, describing an environment that didn't match what viewers saw on screen. Instead of warmth, they described tension. Instead of kindness, they talked about fear, pressure, and silence. At first, it seemed like isolated complaints, the kind that follow any large production. But as more voices came forward, the story grew harder to ignore. Ellen responded publicly, saying she wasn't aware of everything happening behind the scenes. And for some, that explanation was enough. But for others, it raised even more questions. Because if the face of kindness didn't know what was happening under her own roof, then who did? And more importantly, how much was actually hidden from the public all along? Long before any controversy, Rosie O'Donnell and Ellen shared something real. Their connection wasn't manufactured for television. It was personal. Ellen even made one of the most important announcements of her life on Rosie's platform, which made what happened later feel even more unexpected. At some point, something shifted. Not gradually, but suddenly. In a public moment that caught many off guard, Ellen casually stated that she and Rosie were no longer friends. No explanation, no buildup. Just distance. For Rosie, that moment wasn't small. It stayed with her. She later described how confusing and hurtful it felt, especially considering their history. And what made it more unusual was the silence that followed. No clarification, no attempt to fix things publicly. It was as if a chapter had been erased without warning. And when people started revisiting that moment years later, it didn't feel random anymore. It felt like part of a pattern, relationships forming, then quietly disappearing. And that raised a bigger question. Was this just personal, or something deeper about how Ellen operated behind the scenes? Then came one of the most shocking moments tied to this entire timeline. The sudden death of Stephen Twitch Boss. He wasn't just another name connected to the show. He was deeply trusted, widely respected, and seen as one of the most positive figures in that environment. Which is why the news hit so hard. Official reports pointed to personal struggles, but almost immediately, speculation began to spread online. Some sources claimed he had been under significant pressure, particularly in the period after the show ended. Others went further, suggesting he may have been dealing with things he couldn't openly talk about. There's no confirmed evidence supporting those claims, but the timing raised eyebrows. Because his passing didn't happen years later, it happened not long after the show came to an end. And when someone so central to the operation is suddenly gone, people start asking questions. Not necessarily because they have answers, but because the silence feels too heavy to ignore. And in situations like this, uncertainty often creates its own narrative. As more stories started to surface, attention slowly shifted away from just one person and toward the environment itself. Because in Hollywood, these kinds of stories don't exist in isolation. Rosie once shared an uncomfortable moment involving a major celebrity on her show, something that crossed a line. What stood out wasn't just what happened, but how it was handled. Quietly, internally, without turning it into a public issue. And that response says a lot. Because it reflects a system where protecting reputations often matters more than addressing behavior. Over time, more people from different corners of the industry began hinting at similar experiences, situations where boundaries were blurred and silence was expected. It created this unspoken understanding. Some things just aren't meant to be exposed. And when you place Ellen's situation inside that larger context, it starts to feel less like an isolated controversy and more like a reflection of a much bigger culture. One where what happens off camera rarely matches what the audience sees. Not long after that, another tragic event added to the growing sense that something wasn't right. Anne Heche, who had a well-known past relationship with Ellen, was involved in a devastating accident. The incident itself was shocking, but what followed made people pause. Online discussions quickly picked up on the timing, noting how close it was to everything else that had happened. Then came the speculation, claims that she may have been working on something, possibly a project that could have revealed personal or industry-related experiences. None of this has been confirmed, but once those ideas started spreading, they became part of the conversation. And when two individuals connected to the same circle experience tragedies within a relatively short period, people naturally start looking for connections, even if there aren't any proven. It's human nature to try to make sense of patterns, and in this case, the pattern felt unsettling enough that it refused to be ignored. At the same time, people began revisiting Ellen's past connections and public interactions. Interviews, guest appearances, and old clips were suddenly being analyzed in a different light. Some of the names that came up were already surrounded by controversy, which only added fuel to the speculation. Then there was the move. Ellen's decision to leave the United States and settle elsewhere. On its own, that kind of decision isn't unusual. Many celebrities relocate for personal or professional reasons. But again, it was the timing that caught attention. It happened after a series of events that had already raised questions. So instead of being seen as a simple life change, it became part of the larger narrative people were building. Was it coincidence? Was it unrelated? Or was it something else entirely? No one could say for sure. But once people start connecting dots, even loosely, it becomes very difficult to separate fact from interpretation. In the end, what makes this story so compelling isn't any single event. It's how everything fits together, or at least appears to. A public image that collapses, relationships that quietly fall apart, tragic events that happen close together in time, and a growing number of voices suggesting that there's more to the story than what's been officially confirmed. None of it proves anything on its own, but taken together, it creates a sense that something isn't fully understood. And maybe that's why people keep coming back to it, because it feels unfinished, like a story where key pieces are still missing. The real question isn't just about Ellen. It's about how many other stories follow a similar pattern without ever being fully examined. Because if there's one thing this situation has shown, it's that what we see on the surface is rarely the full picture. And sometimes, the truth isn't hidden, it's just never fully revealed. By this point, the conversation had moved beyond Ellen as an individual and started focusing on the industry itself. Figures like Joe Rogan have openly discussed what they believe is a deeper issue within entertainment, a system where image is everything and reality is often hidden. According to these perspectives, many public figures operate in two worlds, the one the audience sees and the one that exists behind closed doors. And the gap between those two worlds can be significant. When you look at past scandals involving powerful figures in Hollywood, it becomes clear that certain behaviors were tolerated, or at least ignored, for years before finally coming to light. So the idea that there could be more beneath the surface isn't as far-fetched as it once seemed. It doesn't mean every theory is true, but it does mean people are more willing to question what they're told. And once that trust is shaken, it's very hard to rebuild.